Early December 1944, the Ardennes forest lay quiet under a bitter winter sky. Deep in the Blankenheim forest, hidden from Allied reconnaissance aircraft, the tanks and half-tracks of a German battle group sat motionless among the pines. This was the spearhead of Hitler's last great gamble in the West. Nearly 5,000 men and 600 vehicles, including 100 tanks, waited for a single word to launch an offensive aimed at splitting the Allied armies and seizing Antwerp. The men lived under strict camouflage discipline, forbidden to light fires or show themselves in nearby villages. To the Americans holding the line 20 miles west, none of this was known. The 1st SS Panzer Division had spent the previous 2 months rebuilding after the mauling it took in Normandy. Replacements poured in 3,500 new troops, and fresh Panthers and Mark IV tanks rolled straight from the assembly lines. But the division was not the elite force it had once been. Many of the newcomers were barely trained boys, and fuel was so scarce that every gallon had to be accounted for. Still, the veterans who had survived the retreat through France and Belgium passed on their hard-won knowledge to the younger men, forging a unit that could still strike hard if given the chance. On the afternoon of December 15, 1944, Joachim Peiper gathered his battalion commanders in a forester's house, deep in the Blankenheim woods. Peiper was a hard-driving officer known for leading from the front, and he made the stakes clear: the battle group was to bypass resistance, ignore its flanks, and drive straight for the Meuse River bridges. There would be no time for prisoners or mopping up. After the tactical briefing, a lieutenant colonel spoke about Operation Greif. 150 German soldiers, many of them English speakers who had lived in the United States, were now wearing American uniforms and driving captured American jeeps. Their job was to spread confusion behind the American lines. Meanwhile, 20 miles to the north, the men of the American 30th Infantry Division were enjoying rest and recreation. The division had been pulled out of the line near Aachen, and battalions rotated through a rest camp in Kerkrade, Holland, for 48-hour breaks. Soldiers cut small Christmas trees and hoarded packages from home, expecting a quiet holiday. There were vague rumors of German paratroopers, and patrols kept watch, but no one believed the enemy was capable of a major attack. The Ardennes was considered a quiet sector, a place where green divisions could be blooded and exhausted ones could recover. That assumption was about to shatter. December 16, 1944. At 5:30 in the morning, the quiet of the Ardennes forest shattered. More than 1,000 German guns opened fire along a 25-mile front. The largest German offensive in the West had begun. For the men of Kampfgruppe Peiper, hidden in the Blankenheim woods for 3 days, the waiting was over. The columns of tanks and half-tracks rumbled forward, their engines drowning out the distant crash of artillery shells falling on American positions ahead. But almost immediately, the advance stalled. The lead Panther of Werner Sternebeck's forward element rolled over a mine just west of Losheim. The explosion tore through the track, the heavy tank grinding to a halt. A second Panther hit another mine 500 meters further on. Both tanks were lost before a single American round had been fired at them. These were German mines, laid months earlier during the retreat to the West Wall, and now they crippled the spearhead before it could strike. Sternebeck climbed into another Panther commanded by Lieutenant Asmussen. The column pushed on, delayed but not broken. Engineers rushed forward to clear the remaining mines. By midnight, Peiper reached the village of Lanzerath. There he found the command post of the 9th Fallschirmjäger Regiment. The paratroop colonel told him the forest ahead was thick with pillboxes and snipers. Peiper asked if the man had personally reconnoitered the position. The answer traveled down the chain of command from colonel to battalion commander to captain. No one had actually seen the Americans. Peiper was furious. He took command of a parachute battalion and ordered an attack on Honsfeld at 4 in the morning. At 0500 hours on December 17th, Kampfgruppe Peiper struck Honsfeld. The town served as the rest center for the 99th Infantry Division. Most of the American troops there had no idea a German offensive was underway. A USO show with Marlene Dietrich had been scheduled for the previous day. Instead of Marlene Dietrich, Sepp Dietrich's men came rolling down the main street. Panthers and half-tracks poured into the town, firing into buildings and parked vehicles. American soldiers scrambled from their bunks half-dressed, many surrendering before they could reach their weapons. The fight was short but violent. A Wirbelwind flak tank, a Panzer IV chassis, equipped with a quadruple 20mm anti-aircraft cannon, commanded by Karl Wortmann, spotted an American anti-tank gun firing from a house entrance. Wortmann cut loose with his quad 20mm cannons, destroying the gun in a burst of fire. 2 German Mobilwagen, open-topped self-propelled anti-aircraft guns were knocked out, their crews killed or wounded. But the sheer speed of the assault overwhelmed the defenders. Within an hour, Honsfeld belonged to Peiper. The booty was enormous: 50 American reconnaissance vehicles, 32.5-ton trucks, and 15 or 16 anti-tank guns, all captured intact. Among the vehicles were American jeeps and trucks driven by German soldiers in American uniforms. These were Otto Skorzeny men from Operation Greif, who had infiltrated ahead of Peiper's column to cause confusion and spread false reports. The flak tank commander spotted them near the Honsfeld cemetery, wearing olive drab and carrying American weapons, and ordered his men to take them aboard his tank as the column rolled on toward Bullingen. The disguised commandos would prove useful in the hours ahead, sowing chaos in the American rear. By 0700 hours, Sternebeck's lead panzers were pushing toward Bullingen. On the way, they surprised an American supply column of 8 trucks coming from Bullingen toward Honsfeld. Sternebeck blinked a red flashlight, and the truck drivers, thinking the Germans were American military police, halted. The column was captured without a shot. Then Sternebeck spotted an airfield to the southwest. He veered off the road and attacked. 6 American spotter planes sat on the strip, their engines still warm. German tanks drove right onto the field and destroyed every one. Bullingen itself was a different story. As the lead tanks entered the town, American infantry opened fire from the upper windows of houses on both sides of the street. The company commander, Captain Preuss, was separated from his men. A Panzer IV in front of Sternebeck was hit by close combat weapons. The entire crew was killed trying to dismount. Sternebeck's column drove wildly through the town, firing at every window. In the confusion, they took a wrong turn and headed north toward Würzfeld before realizing their mistake. Anti-tank fire from the northwest struck another Panzer IV, mortally wounding the commander. Sternebeck wheeled his remaining tanks around and raced back through Bullingen to the western exit. The American engineers of the 254th Engineer Combat Battalion had dug in south and east of the town the night before, but their lines were too thin to stop the German armor. Peiper ordered the advance to continue without pause. The column turned south onto the road toward Moderscheid, climbing through Schoppen and Ondenwall. By late morning, they were approaching the high ground above the village of Thirimont. The road to the Meuse River lay open ahead of them, if they could keep moving. At 11:15 hours on December 17th, Major General Leland Hobbs received orders to move his 30th Infantry Division south to Eupen as quickly as possible. Trucks were loaded, men recalled from passes. The motorized convoy formed up and began rolling through the cold afternoon. The 117th Infantry Regiment led the column. German aircraft dropped flares along their route, lighting up the road, but no bombs struck the convoy. By nightfall, the regiment was approaching Malmedy. Colonel Walter Johnson, the regimental commander, met with officers of the 12th Army Group in Malmedy to determine where to commit his battalions. The enemy situation was fluid and confusing. Reports filtered in of German tanks, American uniforms worn by the enemy, and massacred prisoners. The decision was made: one battalion would reinforce Malmedy, one would head to Stavelot, and one would protect the flank between them. Other American units scrambled to respond. The 526th Armored Infantry Battalion, stationed at Château de Grimonster south of Liège, was ordered to move immediately. Captain Charles Mitchell's company loaded their half-tracks in the late afternoon. The 99th Infantry Battalion was also dispatched south of Malmedy. The 291st Engineer Combat Battalion under Lieutenant Colonel David Pergrin established roadblocks around Malmedy and prepared to demolish bridges. None of these units knew exactly where the Germans were. They only knew that the enemy was coming, and they had to hold. By midday on December 17th, Peiper's column was approaching the Borgnes Crossroads, a small junction on the road between Malmedy and St. Vith. The lead panzers had driven from Thirimont along muddy field trails, crossing the Waimes Road before turning northwest. Sternebeck, riding in the lead panther, saw a long line of American trucks moving south on the road ahead. The convoy was Battery B of the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion, heading from Schevenhütte in Germany to Luxembourg. They had stopped for lunch in Malmedy just an hour earlier. Now they rolled unsuspecting toward the German spearhead. Sternebeck gave the order to fire. High explosive shells slammed into the American column. Trucks burst into flames, drivers swerving off the road. The soldiers, armed only with rifles and pistols, scrambled for cover in the roadside ditches. Sternebeck's tanks charged across the field toward the intersection, machine guns firing. Within minutes, the shooting stopped. American soldiers began emerging from the ditches with their hands raised. Others lay still, either dead or playing dead. Sternebeck radioed Peiper with the news. An American convoy had been caught and destroyed. He was ordered to continue toward Ligneuville without delay. The prisoners were gathered near the crossroads. Approximately 60 to 80 Americans stood in the field, guarded by German engineers and Panzer crews. Peiper himself arrived shortly after, interrogating a captured lieutenant colonel who told him a senior headquarters was in Ligneville. Peiper ordered the lead element to push on. He left the prisoners at the crossroads under the watch of following units. Then the column accelerated south toward the Amblève River, leaving behind the burning trucks and the huddled men in the field. What happened next at that crossroads would echo through the rest of the war. The convoy of Battery B, 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion, rolled south from Malmedy just after noon on December 17th. 26 vehicles carried 140 men, most of them surveyors and radio operators, not infantry. They had been warned. Lieutenant Colonel David Pergrin of the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion had told their officers about German armor in the area and urged them to take a different route. The officers decided to push on. They were already behind schedule. At 1300 hours, as the lead vehicles reached the Baugnes crossroads, the attack struck without warning. American soldiers scrambled for cover as shells and machine gun fire tore through the column. SS soldiers dismounted and began rounding up the survivors, gesturing with their weapons for the prisoners to move toward the crossroads. Among those who surrendered was Tufor Luke Schwartz, who had told his friend Ernest Bechtel just minutes before the attack that something terrible was going to happen. He climbed aboard a truck several vehicles ahead of Bechtel and was never seen alive again. Responsibility for the prisoners passed from unit to unit. First, soldiers from the 2nd Platoon of the 3rd Engineer Company took charge. Then the penal section of the 9th Panzer Engineer Company. Major Werner Poetschke, commander of the 1st Battalion, was reportedly told by Peiper to handle the prisoners. Shortly after, the 7th Panzer Company under Captain Oskar Klingelhofer arrived at the crossroads. Among them was a tank commander named Hans Siptrott, commanding 5 tanks of the 3rd Platoon. Siptrott drove his tank across the field and halted about 300 meters past the crossroads. He was still getting his bearings when his gunner, a man named George Fleps, fired his pistol twice into the group of prisoners. There was no order, no command. Siptrott later said he kicked Fleps but had already hurt his leg hitting the inside of the tank. The sound of those 2 shots changed everything. Other German soldiers in the area, surprised and confused, began firing into the helpless Americans. The prisoners heard the shots and saw their comrades fall. Some of them started to run, heading for the woods or for the cafe. The German officers on the scene shouted for them to stay put, but it was too late. The guards opened fire with machine pistols and rifles. Men were cut down as they sprinted across the open field. Several Americans who had hidden inside the Café Baudarway were burned alive when the Germans set the building on fire. The shooting lasted several minutes. More tanks of Kampfgruppe Peiper passed through the crossroads as the shooting continued. Some of them fired into the bodies lying in the field as they drove by. The Germans did not chase the survivors into the woods. If a man could get out of sight, he was safe. A few crawled into ditches and lay still. Others played dead among the corpses. They listened to the boots of the German soldiers walking among the bodies, searching for any sign of life. When a wounded man was found, the German soldiers finished him off. A bullet to the head or a blow from a rifle butt. One wounded soldier was assisted to his feet and then shot in the back of the head. A medic was ordered to treat another wounded American, and then both men were shot. The cruelty was methodical. Hans Siptrott drove his remaining tanks toward Ligneville and immediately reported the shooting to his commander, knowing that what had happened was not according to orders. The first survivors to reach American lines told their story. The word spread through the 30th Infantry Division like wildfire. SS prisoners were shot on sight by some American units. The massacre at the crossroads became a rallying cry, a symbol of the enemy they were fighting. When the bodies were recovered weeks later, autopsies showed that 41 of the dead had been shot in the head. 10 had severe head injuries from rifle butts. The Malmedy massacre, as it came to be known, hardened the resolve of every American soldier who heard the story. The late afternoon sun was sinking behind the wooded ridges as Kampfgruppe Peiper rolled into the outskirts of Ligneville. This small Belgian town straddled the Amblève River, and for Peiper it held a prize worth more than ground. Intelligence told him the headquarters of the 49th Anti-Aircraft Brigade was somewhere inside these buildings. If he could capture the brigade staff, he might paralyze American artillery coordination across the sector. But the Germans were not the first to arrive. A lone Sherman tank, its tracks removed for repairs, sat near the Hôtel du Moulin, its crew still at their stations. When the lead Panther of Peiper's regiment came racing down the winding road, the Sherman's 75mm gun barked once. The round slammed into the Panther's turret, the tank erupted in flames, and its crew scrambled from the hatches, their uniforms burning. Peiper was 50 meters behind in his half-track. He saw the American cannon swivel toward his own vehicle. The driver wrenched the wheel and ducked behind a stone house, just as another half-track, less fortunate, was torn apart by a direct hit. Peiper grabbed a Panzerfaust from its rack and began creeping forward toward the Sherman. Before he could close the distance, a German self-propelled gun found its mark, and the Sherman burst into flames. The bridge over the Amblève was now secure. All through the small town, the fight was fragmenting into isolated pockets. The service company of the 14th Tank Battalion had been working on vehicle repairs when the first Panthers appeared. Under the covering fire of a tank dozer and a 105mm assault gun manned by a mess sergeant named Lincoln Abraham, who was killed in the melee, most of the maintenance crews escaped southward, but the service battery of the 16th Field Artillery and many support troops were not so lucky. They were rounded up and taken prisoner before they could reach their trucks. Peiper walked into the Hotel des Ardennes, the building that had served as the American Brigade headquarters minutes earlier. The dining table was still set. Cigarettes burned in ashtrays, and half-finished drinks sat on the table. A captured American officer, a lieutenant colonel, told Peiper that the general and his staff had fled just minutes before the Germans entered town. The officer added with grim certainty that the general would return by Christmas. Peiper's column was strung out over miles of winding road, and he needed time to consolidate before pushing west. He ordered his engineers to search the bridge for demolition charges. They found no explosives. The crossing was intact, but the hours lost at Bullingen, at the crossroads near Baugnes, and now at Ligneville were adding up. The timetable for reaching the Meuse was already slipping. As darkness settled over Ligneville, Peiper halted the advance. The lead elements of his battle group needed fuel, ammunition, and rest before the next bound. Trucks and half-tracks ground to a halt along the narrow streets, their engines ticking in the cold air. The men ate cold rations and checked their weapons. Somewhere to the west, the Amblève River twisted toward the town of Stavelot, the next obstacle on the road to the Meuse. Gustav Knittel, the major commanding the 1st SS Armored Reconnaissance Battalion, arrived in the Ligneville area as the last light faded. His reconnaissance vehicles fanned out to screen the western approaches. He and Peiper conferred briefly. The plan was unchanged. At dawn, the battle group would resume its drive, seize the bridge at Stavelot, and push through Trois Ponts toward the open country beyond. But the Americans were no longer surprised, and every mile gained had cost more than the one before. Engineers from the 9th Panzer Engineer Company worked through the night, checking the Amblève crossing for any last traces of American demolitions. The bridge was solid, on the far bank. The road climbed into the dark hills toward Stavelot, where unseen American engineers and infantry were already digging in. Peiper's gamble was still alive, but the hours of darkness were running out, and the defenders were using every one of them. Evening fell cold and dark over the approach to Stavelot on the 17th of December. The men of C Company, 291st Engineer Combat Battalion, had moved out just hours before. Under Sergeant Chuck Hensel, a 12-man squad took up position on the high ground south of the Amblève River. They laid mines across the road and readied their rifles. Hensel sent a lookout down the road beyond the first curve. Private Bernard Goldstein, armed only with an M1 rifle, settled into a small stone shed. For a while the road lay silent. Then he heard the unmistakable rumble of tracked vehicles approaching. Voices called out in German. Goldstein stepped into the middle of the road and raised his rifle. He shouted the one word any American soldier would recognize: halt. The lead tank ground to a stop. German paratroopers riding on the hull leaped down and opened fire with automatic weapons. Hensel and his men returned fire briefly, then withdrew down the hill to the bridge. The German vanguard did not pursue. For reasons of their own, they pulled back into the darkness. The delay cost Kampfgruppe Peiper the night. Dawn would come before they could move again. At first light on the 18th of December, Peiper launched his attack on Stavelot. Tanks and half-tracks charged down the steep road leading to the Amblève Bridge. The narrow approach forced them into a tight column. American defenders were waiting. Anti-tank guns from the 526th Armored Infantry Battalion and the 825th Tank Destroyer Platoon opened fire from positions north of the river. The lead German Panzer took a hit on its turret and slewed to a stop. A second Panzer burst into flames. The column stalled. Sergeant Carl Smith, commanding a 57mm anti-tank squad, watched the Panzers halt just short of the bridge. Then a heavy Tiger tank rumbled forward. Smith's gun crew fired round after round. The shells bounced off the Tiger's thick armor without effect. While the tank duel raged, German infantry crossed the Omblev upstream. They cleared the houses near the bridge in close quarters, fighting. The demolition charges that American engineers had placed on the bridge failed to detonate. An intact crossing fell into Peiper's hands. The Tiger rolled onto the bridge and over the smoking wreck of a half-track. Carl Smith realized his gun was useless and ordered his crew to fall back. They grabbed their wounded and ran for the town square. The Germans were pouring into Stavelot. Captain Charles Mitchell, commanding a company of the 526th Armored Infantry Battalion, saw the situation collapsing. He gathered what men he could and ordered a withdrawal toward the Francorchamps road. Private Jack Mocknick drove Mitchell's jeep through streets under machine gun fire. They zigzagged between burning buildings. Mitchell and Mocknick reached the outskirts of town. There they found the half-tracks of their own company and the tank destroyer platoon retreating up the hill. The road ahead was lined with stacks of 5-gallon gasoline cans, a huge fuel dump stretching for hundreds of yards. Behind them, German tanks were laboring up the slope. Mitchell made a decision. He told his men to light the dump. Soldiers opened cans and spilled gasoline across the road. A match ignited the fuel and flames erupted in a wall of fire. Earlier that morning, a reinforced platoon of the 5th Belgian Fusiliers under 1st Lieutenant Albert Detroze had been guarding the same dump. When Detroze heard the fighting draw near, he ordered his men to load their truck and pull out. They evacuated the last sentries just ahead of the German advance. As the Belgians climbed the road, they met Americans who were already preparing to torch the gasoline. Detroze's interpreter Roger Hardy helped spread the word. Within minutes, the entire front edge of the dump was ablaze. Cans exploded and flew through the air, trailing fire. The German tanks reached the edge of the inferno and stopped. The heat was intense. The road was blocked. They could not drive around the flames because the ground fell away steeply on one side and rose sharply on the other. Peiper spearhead ground to a halt. Behind the wall of fire, the American defenders fell back and reorganized. Major Paul Solis, the executive officer of the 526th, set up a new line north of the burning dump. The delay gave the 30th Infantry Division the minutes it needed. At mid-morning, the lead battalion of the 117th Infantry Regiment arrived. They moved into position on the high ground north of Stavelot and relieved the exhausted armored infantrymen. Mitchell counted his men. Many were missing. Some were dead. The survivors were covered in soot and grime. Peiper's tanks entered Stavelot and secured the town, but they could go no farther. The route west to Trois Ponts and the Meuse was still blocked. The brilliant drive that had carried the battle group from Lanzerath to the Amblev had lost its momentum. The German timetable was shattered. Peiper had expected to reach the Meuse on the first day. He was now 2 days behind schedule, and the Americans were flowing in faster than he could push past them. The road to Antwerp was closing. The stand at Stavelot and the destruction of the gasoline dump marked the turning point. A handful of engineers, a company of armored infantry, and a Belgian platoon had done what seemed impossible. They had stopped a Panzer division in its tracks. The fight for the bridge was over, but the larger battle was just beginning. After the war, Joachim Peiper was tried for the Malmedy massacre and sentenced to death. The sentence was commuted, and he was paroled in 1956. Gustav Knittel was also convicted of war crimes. T4 Luke Schwartz, who had predicted his own death moments before the attack, was among those killed at the crossroads. Werner Sternebeck, Karl Wortmann, Hans Siptrott, David Pergrin, Charles Mitchell, and Sergeant Carl Smith all survived the war. The defense of Stavelot stands as a reminder that determination and quick thinking can blunt even the most powerful offensive. It was not a tank or a general that broke the spearhead. It was a private who stepped into a dark road and a sergeant who lit a match. If you have family stories from the Battle of the Bulge, we would love to hear them in the comments. Please subscribe and give this video a like to support our work. Thank you for listening.